perhaps on the scale of holiness or a scale of virtue, there's two ends. The one end would be the scrupulous, those who would be the ones that say, "Oh, Father, I'm not holy. You don't know what I've done." And those would include those that scrutinize their own sins, but also the unchurched, who just denounce themselves as unholy people. And then on the other end, perhaps we could call them the prideful, those who will pronounce their holiness and acclaim that they've lived holy lives and aren't ashamed to show it. That's not as common, but there are people out there who do that. All of us have an idea, though, of what holiness should look like. Usually we base that upon other people that we know. I remember as a child when I was altar serving, there would be some pious old women in the front pew who, at the elevation, they'd strike their breasts and pronounce "my Lord and my God," or just pious acts like that. And then what do you think I started doing as a 12-year-old? "My Lord and my God." Like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm just imitating those ladies there that look holy. Little did I know. But we base our holiness on others, or what we see as holy in them. And then we fill it in with things from other places, maybe things we picked up from online, or if we're watching EWTN or reading a Catholic news article, we fill this all in. But it's got to be, we have to be mindful to avoid that far end, spiritual pride that can exist. And maybe we're not outwardly showing it, but inwardly it exists within us. That, you know what? I'm not doing too bad. I go to Mass every week. I say my prayers. I maybe judge others, but not that bad. Right? I even judge other people, though, and I say they're not getting into heaven just by their acts. But really, brothers and sisters, who are we to judge? Who are we to be God? All of us have that temptation, of course. Every sin is us wanting to be God, ultimately, and turning from Him. It's putting our will before God's will. And so there's a pride that exists, and we see it in our gospel today. Let's recount where we are in Mark. In Mark 9 starts with the transfiguration, right? Jesus goes up to the mountain. He's transfigured before Peter, James, and John. And then the other disciples go back, and even though Jesus has kind of said, "Don't tell anyone," well, guess what? They tell others. And then we get to our gospel today, and the disciples are bickering amongst themselves about who's the greatest. Who's the greatest in the land? Who's the greatest? Pride there. And these unclean desires, then, that are in their hearts that come out. You can only imagine the conversation. This is just a snippet of it. But I had a fun time in my prayer of just imagining what their conversation was like. What are they saying amongst each other about who really is the greatest amongst them? And what are their reasons for saying why they're the greatest? Why they're maybe the holiness? But why are they asking who's the greatest? Because the greatest one is amongst them, and they know that. It's Jesus, that one who transfigured, and then after the transfiguration in Mark 9, he heals somebody. That's the greatest one that's amongst them. And yet, they're looking for who's the greatest because they're looking for who's going to enter the kingdom of God. Who's going to inherit this kingdom? And they're arguing amongst themselves. But Jesus then upturns it. He says, the greatest, as in he knows it's himself, and he's not being prideful, but he is God. There's nobody greater than God. The greatest one amongst us is to be handed over to men, and they'll kill him, and after 3 days, the Son of Man will rise again. That's the greatest. If I was one of the disciples, I'd be scratching my head and be like, what? Who is this guy? And what definition of that is great? How is that great? To get handed over, to then be killed, and then to do the impossible? Little do they know. And Jesus then puts a child in front of them. Children, by their very nature, represent ones who are not fully grown. They have growth to do. And even though we say I have a great kid, or maybe I have a great grandkid, we know there's still further greatness that's expected of them. For whatever reason, in adulthood, we just kind of give up at a certain point and say, well, good enough. 21, not much more growth that's going to happen after that. We shouldn't, but we do. It's funny. Children, by their very nature, though, represent growth. And there's much life and maturity that's left in them that has to happen. It's the exact opposite of what our culture defines as success, this example of Jesus being handed over and dying and then rising again, and then a child who's not done growing. After all, our culture defines success as people who are famous, who are wealthy, and who have power. That's what our culture defines success as, those three things. Jesus doesn't really have any of these things. Sure, he's known. Sure, he's got power, God's power. But doesn't have wealth in the way we would define it. He doesn't have these things in the way that our culture would define it. Jesus' passion prediction then teaches the disciples that true success takes the form of the cross. True success is a pouring out of oneself. Because on the cross, Jesus accomplishes God's victory over sin and death, not by acquiring prestige or wealth or worldly power, but by handing himself over to a shameful death, by being, in other words, humiliated, made to look like a fool, a failure in the eyes of the world. Yet, from our second reading from St. Paul, Paul says to us, the wisdom of this age is foolishness in the eyes of God. Foolishness in the eyes of God. Because for Christians, our success is achieved by imitating Christ. It may be achieved by failing, if we look at it in that regards. Somebody who's had failed health, but who's united their sufferings with Christ on the cross, has ultimately won. They've achieved victory because they've conformed their lives to him. They've conformed their lives to the cross. And so, my question for all of us today is, what is the idea of holiness that we've put in our minds? What is the idea of holiness that we've put in our minds? Where on that scale of holiness, from just utter humility and I'm not holy, to I'm very proud and I'll tell you I'm holy, where on that scale are we? And how far are we, my friends, from the cruciform love of the cross, the pouring out once and for all as he did for us? We often figure that we can't conform ourselves to the cross, and certainly none of us here will probably die that horrible death on the cross that he died. But we can pour ourselves out in love as he did. My friends, success isn't what we would define it as. It isn't what we'd imagine it as. But success comes in the form of a cross, the cross of Jesus Christ.